Okay, so my name is Marcel Morin. I live in Grand Pré, and yes, I've been posting all kinds of maps on Facebook over the years and gone a little crazy with some of the data that's been available. I've been making maps for about 30 years. I went to COGS in Lawrencetown and graduated in 1992, and I was kind of the last wave of students who were taught manual cartography. So we were making maps by hand with dark rooms and light tables and big giant cameras. And so it was the traditional way of making maps that had been going on since, after World War II, that type of map. And right about my second year, I got introduced to GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and it was that where I kind of realized that computer mapping was the way to go. So when I graduated, I moved to Vancouver and got a job with a forest consultant. Then I worked as a GIS cartographer for 15 years, and then moved back to Nova Scotia in 2006, long before everyone else started moving back, and bought an old Jeremiah Calkin planter house and been living there for 15 years and continue to do mapping. So I'm gonna just blitz you with all kinds of maps and just talk about them and kind of go show you some older projects that I've worked on over the years, and then get into some of the newer stuff. So this is a student project. This is an example of traditional cartography, one of my thematic maps, and that's all made by hand. Scribing, everything, the text is all laid by hand, and it's all reprographic using large format cameras to do your full color print. So that's kind of the career that I was heading towards. This would be another example of a map, a topo map. I decided to do Vancouver since I was moving there. And that's all done by hand. Everything's been hand scribed and all the text has been laid out by hand. So traditional cartography was very meticulous and very hands-on, and a lot of coordination involved and a lot of hunched over, meticulous. You're working for hours on end. Yeah. Those maps, it's probably about 200 hours, 250 hours. Very labor intensive, and everything you have to take care of. Everything you have to wear white gloves, because if you wreck something, there goes 50 hours of work. So it was it's very okay. Mylar, yeah. The how's that? Yeah, you're using different types like Mylar's special scribe coats that had a coating on them that would block ultraviolet light, and then all kinds of masks and large format films, and you're developing film and halftone screens and all kinds of little different techniques to do bending of light to create vignette effects and stuff like that. But now it's all those kind of techniques are all like computer algorithms now that make these effects. So this is a GIS project. This was my third kind of major project. And so I digitized all the 100 series highways in Nova Scotia and linked those up with a database that had traffic counters, those little rubber hoses that you put across and then created this map that shows, traffic volumes across Nova Scotia. And that's kind of where the light went off that, okay, you're taking this arbitrary, meaningless data and making a picture out of it. So then I decided that I would abandon manual cartography and go down the GIS path. And then, so when I started Timberline, this is kind of like a fun project, trying to keep myself, learning, because I'm more on the artistic side than the analytical side. So I was kind of making projects to see what the GIS software that I was using back then, which was all program. You had to write programs and run the programs and do creative design, but through a program. So this is a map I just made for fun to see what the limit was with the GIS software I was using. And these would be the type of maps that I eventually got into working for the consultant that I worked for. And this one was called Canadian Arctic Railway. And I guess there was a consortium of businesses or something that were proposing crazy idea of railways all across the Arctic, Alaska, and then connecting to Russia. Another example of typical work that I would have been doing, these are recreation tenures in the Sea to Sky corridor of Vancouver. It was an extremely busy place when it comes to recreation. Whoever was overseeing that kind of wasn't really doing their job, and they didn't know who was doing what where. And a snowmobile tourist rented a snowmobile and he lost control and it hit a dog sled team and killed a bunch of dogs. That got in the media and they basically wanted it fixed. So they came to the company I worked for and basically said, we need this done in a week. And so I basically had to sort all this data and create something that kind of made sense so that they could keep track. And this is heli skiing, heli hiking, mountain biking, horseback riding, ATVs, like just the whole, and it's all done on Crown land. So they really needed to, the government looked bad that they actually didn't know who was doing what where. And some of the type of forestry mapping that we would do, this is visual quality objective mapping, and it's sort of forest trickery that the world of forestry does, where they would do cut block designs so that if you're driving on a road, you'll never see it. But it's all tied into visual quality objective mapping, where they crunch a bunch of numbers that once you do a certain amount of clear cuts, that visual, when you reach that threshold, then you can't do it anymore because it doesn't look nice. So that was kind of some of and those images are done with World Construction Set. This is a fire growth scenario after the big forest fires in 2001. These were some modeling algorithms that were trying to track forest fires based on inputs of slope, aspect, and fuel types. This is tourism mapping that I got into. This is kind of my forte, is as opposed to GIS type of projects. This style of map in a print publication. So this was done this is a railway tourism map. So people could be traveling on the railway and they could know where they were, know what the mountains that they were passing by. This was a two-sided map that was printed and sold. For years I got into mountaineering, and I worked with Don Searle. He's a famous mountaineer who's been going to the Waddington Range since the 1970s. So this was specifically done for the mountaineering community. It's not a high-selling map because everyone that goes there basically has to rent helicopters and has to fly in. You got to know what you're doing when you go to this place, because it's all glaciers. So this was a map that I produced for the mountaineering community, and then that sold for many years. And this was the second in the series. This was the Bugaboos, which is in eastern part of BC, Bugaboos Provincial Park. And this is a World Construction Set image, so it's a perspective view of the mountains. And then the other side is the topo map. This is a more popular climbing center, so a lot of people go there for climbing. So that was a lot. That sold a lot more copies compared to the Waddington map. In the mid-90s, I started. The company I worked for partnered up with Pikangikum First Nation in Northern Ontario. And so their goal was to turn their traditional territory into a sustainable forest license based on Indigenous knowledge. So they were going to basically use their knowledge of the land to drive the forest management plan. And so I started working in 1996, developing a rudimentary forest cover, and then eventually a proper forest cover. And then that was one component of the project. And then the second component was traditional use mapping. And so this project, we entered in about 3,000 points, lines, and polygons. And so I flew to Pikangikum and I trained about 4 or 5 youth in GIS, and some of them had never used computers before. And so they basically sat and set up interview process, and they would interview elders, and basically, where did you hunt, where did you trap, So they spent about a year doing this, and that's them there showing off their maps. And so this is one of the maps, historical occupancy. And so this is basically everything from Wendigo sites and spiritual sites of Pikangikum First Nation. And this is all elders' knowledge. And this is just one zoom in of an area. And then the second component was ecological value. So we were basically tracking, the fish, the caribou, and this is all knowledge from the elders. So the youth would sit and interview the elders, and they would draw on maps, and then they would digitize and enter all the data. So that kind of shows a distribution of a whole bunch of categories. And then that's the overview of the white feather. This area is their traditional trapping line. That whole area is based on historical trap lines, and then that shows you the distribution of all the indigenous knowledge that we had gathered over about a year. And then using this data combined with forestry data, it was basically a blending of traditional knowledge and Western science, and that was used to drive this whole management plan. So this is the big open house that took place in Red Lake to kind of show off what they wanted to do. And it's not just it wasn't just forestry, it was all kinds of different things, ecotourism that they wanted to get into. And those are all the elders who basically during this whole event sat and never moved the whole day because they were very staunch supporters of this. And you can see the women still wear, in Pikangikum, still wear the traditional, that plaid dress that goes back to when they were trading with the Hudson's Bay Fur Company. They would trade bolts of this plaid material, and so their traditional outfits that they would have wore, they changed them over and started wearing those types of dresses, and they still wear them today. And that's just an example of a species map based on the forest cover that was created. And this is just a rendering using World Construction Set to kind of show one of the events that takes place in the boreal forest, which is big blowdowns, a big microburst that will flatten large tracts of trees. And then this is the resulting management plan that was basically Western science and First Nation knowledge and it was all driven by First Nations. So the greens are protected areas, the yellows are buffer zones. Then that project morphed into another big project, which was Pimachiwa Key, which was a UNESCO nomination that went on for 10 years. And Pikangikum was also part of that, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's comprised of 4 First Nations. So this is just one planning map that I did when Pikangikum was part of it, and that's basically when you're arguing for a UNESCO nomination, the UNESCO wants to know what are all this stuff that takes place in the landscape. So this is basically showing all the activities for each of the First Nations that were part of it. And then Pikangikum dropped out. So we ended up doing 3 submissions over 10 years. The first submission was deferred by UNESCO, mainly because the UNESCO didn't quite understand the First Nation perspective to the land, so they had to recalibrate a lot of how they deal with First Nations. And then the second submission, Pikangikum pulled out right at the last minute, so then we had to do a third submission that removed, and now it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so I've continued to work for Pimachiwa Key and some of the individual First Nations that are part of it, developing these traditional place name maps or story maps. And these are going to be going into the new schools that are being built on the reserve. And all these traditional place names come from the elders. And then this one's for Blood Vein River. For about starting in 2006, I started working with the Métis General Council of Alberta with Ecoplan International based out of Vancouver. And this was a traditional use oral history project for the 7 Métis settlements in Alberta. So those are all the Métis settlements. So we interviewed 450 community elders, produced about 1,500 maps and 8 atlases. So the traditional use component is basically asking the participant, where did you hunt, where did you trap, where did you pick berries? And so these are an example of the interview sheets that we would fill in. So we would fill in the interview sheets, and then that would be input into a database of attributes that's connected to an area on the ground or a line on the ground. The second page, there was thousands of those interview sheets. And then that's an example of a traditional use map for one participant of his area of where he would have hunted and trapped, gathered berries. And then that's an open house that the pilot project was for Buffalo Lake. So this is the open house where we were displaying all the maps to the community. And then the second part was oral history. So there was 5,000 interview sheets and over 11,000 fully attributed points, lines, and polygons. And this is kind of like oral genealogy. So they're basically trying to track where the Métis came from. Where did your grandparents live? Where did they work? And where did they move? So this is an interview sheet that would start with the participant, and it would go all the way back to the father, the grandparents, and the great-grandparents. And then you end up with a map like this that shows these flight lines of movement of this person's family. And then there's this archival research component that is using archival research to verify some of this oral history. So we use one sample participant showing her oral history of where she moved. And then there was a whole archival research where people were going to archives in Alberta and all the way back into Ottawa to research this. And these are some examples of some of the kind of trickery that happened to the Métis, where they were, given a piece of land and basically had to give up their status. But that piece of land was probably 700 kilometers from where they were, so they would never have access to it at all. And then they would build these trees. And then this is basically showing this participant and all of the archival hits that were found in research. And then that is all the settlements and all the archival research. So the frequency, the big circles are basically how many quantities of archival research. And then this is just a distribution of all across Canada. And then this is just an overview map that shows all of the traditional use mapping that we did. So that's kind of the extent of all of the settlements, their traditional use. Yep.
You mentioned all of these incredible attributed points. Are those points all location, or are they
Yep.
GPS?
So we would basically I would make maps. They would get sent back to Alberta, and then someone would go to their house, set up an interview, lay everything out on the table, and then they would draw everything, fill in the sheets, and then that would all get sent back to me, and then I would go and input all that data in. So yeah, so there's either polygons, which is an area, like I fished on this lake, or a point, I did something here, or a line, like a river that I fished on, and it's all in GIS software. And then this is all of the historical communities, the oral history of movement for all of the Métis settlements and all 400. So you can kind of see a pattern there, going back to Winnipeg, which is where Louis Riel and the whole thing that went down there in the 1860s. And then this is traditional use with oral history. I'm going to completely change subjects here now. So this is a project that I worked with Ralph Applebaum in New York. They're a design firm that does big architectural installations. And they were doing a project for SC Johnson in Racine, Wisconsin. and they wanted a massive floor map that was going to be made out of end grain wood block. So it was going to be 4 different colors of end grain wood block built on the floor. And the history behind it is the founder of S.C. Johnson. Their headquarters is a very famous Frank Lloyd Wright, one of the most famous Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. And they were building a second building to commemorate the founder, who flew in a Sikorsky amphibious plane from Racine, Wisconsin. You can kind of see the flight line all the way to Fortaleza, Brazil. And that there's a jog there in Brazil where it goes out inland a bit. That's where they went and landed in Fordlandia. I guess Ford had wanted to make his own rubber for his tires, so he started a rubber farm or something deep in the Amazon and called it Fordlandia, so they'd visited there. And then this is just more prototypes as I came up with a map projection and how we were going to deal with the data and how that data was going to get passed to another subcontractor that was going to be in charge of breaking it up into tiny little 4 by 4 inch pieces of wood. And then this is the construction of it, being the whole footprints being laid out on the cement, and then you can see the end grain wood blocks being installed, and the flight path is the shoreline is aluminum, and then the flight path is more aluminum with all the locations that they landed, and that's kind of a zoom in of the end grain wood block. And then that's the final, that's the Sikorsky plane that they flew to Brazil. I've never seen the map. I've never been there, so. And then that's the hall for Tensla Hall in Racine, Wisconsin, north of Chicago. And you can see that little photo. You can see the Frank Lloyd Wright building off in the distance there. Completely changing subjects again. So this is a map I did for the Friends of McNabb's Island. This is a big 8-foot by 4-foot high map of the island at a kiosk on the island. And I worked with Sperry Design, and there's this map, and then there's a bunch of other interpretive panels that talk about the fascinating history of McNabb's Island, and you know, the whole military history, the old forts, the World War II forts, you know, the brackish pond, and if you haven't been to McNabb's Island, you have to go, because it's just an amazing place. And maybe some of you have seen these around. These are interpretive panels that I did for the landscape of Grand Pré. So these are all around Grand Pré. And so the challenge with this was to, you know, take some complicated text and incorporate a map that you know, because not everyone is into reading a lot of stuff, and so the challenge is to create something that, you know, the map explains itself, but the text augments it. And this was a really good project. The people that participated in the writing did a really good job in boiling down the text so that it's only about 250 words and only takes you about 30 minutes or 30 seconds to read. So this is the one out at the Guzzle, showing kind of how Boot Island has changed over time, because it used to be connected to North Grand Pré. And this one's a little bit of history of Boot Island. Somebody did live out there. Well, the guy that Biggs, who lived in our house, that was moved before he bought Jeremiah Calkin House, he actually lived on the island, and that's an official certificate. There used to be a fox farm on the island. And then this is one of the plan of Horton Town, the Horton Town plot, which was going to be this Hortonville was going to be the official center, but then Wolfville became more the administrative center, and that was going to be a traditional British style grid pattern, and everyone was going to live happily there. But it didn't work out, and everyone just started trading plots. And then this one's just an overview showing the Grand Prairie dikes. And with this one, I use old aerial photography and was able to digitize all of the original Acadian dikes all of the first order drainage patterns, because before the Acadians diked everything off, the tide would come in every two times a day and then drain, and there was all kinds of intricate little drainage patterns that would drain that dike land. And as farming progressed over, and by the 70s, mechanized tractors came in, and all those first order drainage patterns were all pushed over. And so they had to replace those with man-made diking and ditches. So you go from a natural drainage pattern to a man-made drainage pattern because it's just so flat. And this is the big granite table in Grand Pre at the. They were still showing up in photos air photos from 1940. You could still see the remnants of them. So I just took the photo and geo-referenced it so it matches the coordinate system, and then you can go in and digitize the old dikes. And now with LiDAR, you can see some remnants of old dikes around. This is the big granite table that's up at the View Park in Grand Pre. My wife Angela designed that park, and then we put this big granite table in, and that's kind of the map that's there. And it was etched by Heritage Memorials in Windsor, who have a big laser machine. And this is the machine doing the etching on the black granite, and that's it being installed. And that's the final. So it allows you to sit there, look at the view, and kind of look at the map and eat, have a picnic. I also worked on the Grand Prairie Trail Society, which is, we still have that little Facebook page. And we started that group to kind of push the county to bring the trail from Wolfville to Grand Prairie. So I figured some of the counselors kind of weren't into it. So I figured I'll make this really complicated map and just show all the potential that the trail has. I'll show all the local businesses and how the connectivity with local businesses, and how by having people on the trail, there's a lot of beautiful spots between Wolfville where the rail had cut off the dike lands, and now they're like these beautiful marshes that are just full of birds. And so that was a project that I worked on for a number of years, and we published a little book and sold it for many years to raise money to do something on the trail at some point. And so this book we talked about geology, showing the drumlins and some of the old tree stumps that are still out there at the guzzle. And I also worked on the Harvest Moon Trail map for the Annapolis Valley or the Trails Coalition. So there's 21 of these maps. And each map at each location has a profile that cuts the Annapolis Valley in two, so you can kind of see where you are and see where you are in the valley and in the context of the North Mountain and the South Mountain. What's that? I can print it for you. It's a project I worked on for the Wine Association of Nova Scotia, showing all the wineries in Nova Scotia. And the backside is basically where all the wineries are, which is in this area. And so with this map, I try to create all the travel routes that if people are going to go and visit all the wineries, that I would force them to drive through the landscape and appreciate the beauty of the landscape and not just make it about wine. This is a map that was published by Annapolis Valley Regional Enterprise Network and the Chamber of Commerce. And this is just basically, we incorporated everything, like all monuments, history, parks, everything that's available in the Annapolis Valley from Grand Prairie to Digby. That made one print run, and then they never really printed it again, which is too bad. That photo's by Chris Shepard. This is a project I worked for Parks Canada. This is Beaubassin and Fort Lawrence National Historic Site. So this is basically showing the position of Fort Lawrence, the position of Fort Beauséjour, with all of the dike lands in between, showing all the original Acadian settlements that were there at one time. And this is a combination of aerial photography and LiDAR data. And then the second panel is basically showing 18th century trade between the Acadians and New England and Louisbourg, and a lot of the movement of Mi'kmaq travel routes. And then that project kind of morphed into another project that was for Parks Canada in collaboration with DeBert and a bunch of First Nations. I think it was called the Chignecto Traveling Exhibit. So this is basically showing historical movement of the Mi'kmaq in this area, using waterways as transportation. So this is a project I did for Weingart in Windsor. Rob and Astrid, who had the foresight to want a map that talks about soils and makes a connection between soils and wine, but not just wine, but soils and agriculture and where food comes from. So this is all the soil types of this area. And that was a very, very big map that they had on their wall, so they could use it as it's a combination of a technical soils map, but also an art piece. So if you're not into maps, you can just look at all the pretty colors. I did this for the Avon River Arts Society. They kind of felt that that part is forgotten about and no one really knows that there's anything there. So we made this map that basically shows all the local businesses and local artists and artisans, and that project turned out really, really nice. It was nice to be able to do a project like that for an arts group. Probably seen this around Wolfville. This is the town of Wolfville. This is basically a nightmare map where you're trying to do as much detail as you can, but at the same time make it simple so people can understand it and read it. And so it looks kind of like a diorama. I worked with Adam Barnett, who did the Where to Cycle in Nova Scotia. This book here, and I think it was about 70 different cycling routes throughout Nova Scotia, and that was a very interesting project. And this is projects that I've been working for Goose Lane. This is the Waterfalls of Cape Breton by Benoit Lalonde. There's about 100 waterfalls. So these are little maps that help you not only get to the waterfall, but because some of them are so remote and involved, so that they're trying to show you the roads to get to that spot. But a lot of these waterfalls are not trails where you can just walk on it under a sign. A lot of these waterfalls, you're bushwhacking. So you kind of have to know what you're doing to get there. This is a map I did for Goose Lane, another one. Where is it? It's this book called On Borrowed Time by Gregor Craigie. It's just about potential disasters that could happen in these hot spots across North America. I did this for Parks Canada. This is an interpretive panel on George's Island, a big interpretive panel that talks about George's Island being a drumland and how it was formed during the Ice Age. And then this one is, I worked with scientists at Department of Fisheries and Oceans who did all the number crunching to come up with these future scenarios based on CO2 emissions. So there's two low CO2 emission and a high CO2 emission. One's 50 years and 100 years. And then you're also combining a worst case scenario of a super king tide hurricane that pushes the water up. And this is kind of what George's Island would look like in 50 to 100 years. This was a couple of summers ago. This is Sable Island. This was a really fun project to work on. We had really good high-resolution ortho imagery and LiDAR data. So this is a two-sided map that basically shows you where most people land on the island, and then most people will go the center map. Most people will make that walk, that trek from the western end to Bondrup-Nielsen, which is just an absolutely massive pile of sand. It's just mind-boggling how you can see that photo there of the people standing on top of it. It's just hard to believe that this is here off the coast of Nova Scotia. And then this is the backside that talks about the horses, about the seals, and the ecology on the island. A little blurb on how it was formed during the last ice age as the ice retreated, and the possibility that the Mi'kmaq could have been there, because as the ice melted, the sea level rose, but there were larger pieces of land out there. But as the ice melted, and Sable Island is kind of an end moraine or a terminus where the glaciers just pushed all the sand, and then that's kind of the end of it that's left there just before it falls into the trench. Project for Kejimkujik. Everyone loves Kejimkujik. This is a project I did for a big archaeological event that took place in Cape Breton, and it's basically showing a lot of the historical archaeology in this area. And this is using Sentinel-2 satellite imagery and LiDAR data. A project I did for Lightfoot and Wolfville, and this is LiDAR data. So there's the bare earth data, which is basically the bare ground where the trees and everything's been stripped off. But this is LiDAR data that basically captures everything. So, in this data, you could see the outlines of sheep and cows and telephone lines and cars, and everything gets picked up with the LiDAR. And so Lightfoot and Wolfville has made a trail that connects to the Harvest Moon Trail. And these are just some smaller 18 by 9 inch fold-out maps that I've done for the landscape of Grand Prairie, Taylorhead Provincial Park, and the Seaside Kedge Park. And these are just fun maps that I've been working on. This is just pure LiDAR data. So I just trying to experiment using a rendering software called Blender, and so you can just see how much detail LiDAR has picked up, because it's all the little detail in Blomidon has been captured there. So it's just these are just some grayscale maps that I'm having fun with. More LiDAR down in Cape Sable Island, and I decided to talk about the Cape Islander fishing boat. That I didn't know that fishing boat is all over the world, but it was invented. It was invented there. I was always fascinated with Moses Mountain, because the older data sets the resolution wasn't as good. This weird thing always appears, and with LiDAR you can really see it, and it's a large grandiorite pluton, hundreds of millions of years ago. Giant bubbles of magma kind of popped up, and when the surface got eroded, this pluton goes from Peggy's Cove all the way to Kejimkujik. But this area, you could see the pressure that was formed, and that's these lines that are horizontal. Apparently, there's a lot of uranium there, but there's a moratorium in Nova Scotia for uranium, so. So LiDAR is basically, it's a laser. So it's a helicopter or a drone or a plane flies, and it just sprays the ground with millions of points. And so as the helicopter's flying, it has GPS, so it knows where it is. When that laser point hits the ground, it calculates the distance that it travels, and then it knows the XY coordinate of where that laser touches, whatever it touches, a leaf, a power line. And so it knows the XY coordinate and the Z value. and it's doing these millions of points, just spraying the entire landscape with these. It's called a point cloud. So it's just basically three-dimensional points that have an X, Y, Z value. And then from that, I can generate these hill shading models that kind of give a nice sense of relief. In Nova Scotia, it's the whole province is open source. You can download all the LiDAR data, and if you have the proper software, you can use it. Nova Scotia PEI and New Brunswick all have free open source LiDAR data for the whole province. It was a very powerful tool, but I'm using it mainly for fun. Another fun project that did of showing the disappearing island of Boot Island. So the outer blue line was taken off of a 1946 aerial photo. Then the yellow line is from 2010 LiDAR, and the red line is from 2019 LiDAR. So you can see, and I've calculated the reduction of the island in 1946 to 2019. So enjoy it while you can, because it's not going to be around. This is more LiDAR data, having fun with a 3D animation software called Aerialod. So I did the famous Isle Hot. That's a perspective view. I colorized it. This is a view looking from Annapolis Royal up the Annapolis Valley. Again, LiDAR and Aerialod 3D animation software. So you can see on the left is the North Mountain, which is flood basalt. So 200 million years ago, a big rip opened up. Lava just kind of oozed up and poured over the surface. And so you can see that's the ripples on the North Mountain where the lava just kind of slowly and then just stopped. And then that rip, as the lava cooled, it sunk down, and then that formed the Minas Basin. And on the other side is that batholith I was telling you about, the granite pluton. And that pluton goes from Peggy's Cove all the way to, so you get two extremely different geological formations in the Annapolis Valley. A couple of years ago, I got commissioned by the Canadian Space Agency to do, it's called the Satellite Art Project. And so they wanted to do some cool images from space. So I chose this area of Meat Cove on Cape Breton Island, and it's a winter shot. And so this is a Sentinel-2 satellite image, which is also open source. You can download the imagery and the LiDAR data merged together. And so the image has a 3D. So I kind of became obsessed with this data now, because you can search and find data that's cloud-free. You can use fall imagery. So this one's one of the northern tip of PEI in the winter, and you can see all the ice flow patterns. This is just after Hurricane Fiona, literally a couple days later, and you can really see how Hurricane Fiona just shook everything up, and all that sedimentary rock in PEI and the shoreline erosion. So again, this is a Sentinel-2 merged with LiDAR data. A shot of Confederation Bridge. This is just cool because Cape Split is doing its thing and hooked the clouds in an interesting way. Shot of El Houghton, Cape Chignecto. Looks like a sea monster getting a little fish. This is another zoom in of Bald Dune on Sable Island. You can see how just massive that sand dune is. That's LiDAR data and ortho imagery. This is again taking LiDAR data and lowering and raising the sea level. So what I did here is I've raised the sea level up to what would be a super tide. So this kind of gives you a rough picture of what this area would have looked like before dikes came in. So when the tide came in, all those darker areas would have been an intertidal zone. And then I've added all the historic dikes. Of course, the shoreline wouldn't have looked like that 300 years ago because it's constantly changing, but it just gives you a nice idea of what was a large intertidal salt marsh. Did the same thing for Windsor. So this one shows what the Falmouth area would have looked like before the dikes came in and before that big causeway went in. The Acadian settlements are there. The old road, which was used by the British historically, and the travel route of the Mi'kmaq. This is the Chignecto Isthmus again, showing what would have been an intertidal zone. Mi'kmaq travel routes, the big ship railway that was built. I can't remember what date, but the theory was they were going to haul ships from one end to the other on a railway track, so they could bypass having to go around Nova Scotia. And remnants of that are still there. This is one that just because it shows you all of the historical fortifications in Halifax from 1755 till now. Shows you how much, I always say Halifax is totally armed to the teeth for many years. And I also added the historic lighthouses too. This is one that shows the Joggins. So you have a combination of the Joggins fossil cliffs. Before that, there was coal mining that took place in the area. And then all the Acadian settlements that would have existed. And the red line is the historic railway. There was a railway that went there. This is Canso Island's National Historic Site. And that is the Fort William Augustus. That little star fort actually shows up in the LiDAR. And that was basically used by the British as a landing zone before they went and took out Port Louisbourg. This is an interesting one of Metagan. So this is in the fall. So you have drumlin formations, and the hardwood trees like to sit on top of the drumlins because it's drier. So the leaves have changed. So you can see the lighter colored leaves are on top of the drumlins. The lower wetland areas are the coniferous trees are lower down. And then you have an urban pattern. Those lines, the Acadians who were allowed to come back after the deportation were given large plots of land that had water access and then went way inland so they could have wood access. And so over 150 years, the family slowly subdivided, passed down to the kids, and those plots, long, wide plots of land, slowly got thinner and thinner and thinner. And that long, all those lines are those patterns of 100 years of subdivision. So it's interesting. You have a ecological and you have a human pattern all in one image. Yeah, the seigneurial system type of thing. Yeah. This is the Tuscan Islands and the Chebogue River. That's taken in the fall. So that Chebogue River, that is just one massive wetland that really, really pops out in the fall. The colors. You can see Yarmouth there. This is it's another feature in Nova Scotia that always caught my eye, like the Moses Mountain area. This weird thing that just pops out. I don't know what the geology of that is, but you can see the water patterns along the shore as the water's moving the shoreline. That's Mabu is just up to the north part, Cape Breton. This is a little dark, but this is Seal Island. It's the furthest island south of Nova Scotia. There were people did live on that island at one time, and those are all the historical lighthouses. And then this is kind of dark, you can't see, but I sucker for punishment. I decided I would digitize all the historic railways in Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick. So the dark red ones are all the railways that used to be in Nova Scotia and now are all gone. And then all the dots are historic lighthouses. Yeah, that was easy because it's still there. But you can still see a lot of these railways in Google Earth if you know what you're looking for. That's the Manicouagan impact crater in Quebec. That's Sentinel-2 imagery taken in the winter, so I thought that was cool. Of course, there's large dams that have filled that up. This is the Mackenzie River drainage basin. So this is Canada's released high Arctic. It's almost like LiDAR data for the high Arctic. So the entire Arctic now has 2-meter LiDAR data. So now you can start doing merging Sentinel imagery with LiDAR to get a three-dimensional. And so I just found this fascinating, the amount of drainage stuff that's there. This is probably not many people have seen this, but Merriam Fjord on Baffin Island. So you have Sentinel-2 information with this high-resolution LiDAR data to create a three-dimensional, so you can really see the glaciers and the mountains. This is the McKean River on Baffin Island again. This is in spring, the snow is starting to melt. So you have land cover, but you still have snow, and I just thought that had some very interesting textures to it. No, I go everywhere, but I don't go anywhere. This is Tuktoyaktuk. I'm working on a project for Trans-Canada Trail, and the blue dots are the pingos. And that data set was actually Doug and Cormier Morse, who live in Grand Prairie. Their son is a geologist, and he led that project in doing the analysis to find all these pingos. So the blue dots are pingos. Pingos are a giant frozen, looks like a volcano, but it's just frozen water that's pushed the land up. Those could be, gone with global warming. Project I'm working on right now for Chilcotin Territorial Government. It's a first base oversee about 5 First Nations in the Chilcotin Plateau. So they want this massive wall map so that they can show people their territory and talk about it as a centerpiece. So this kind of shows you a design process to create this giant map, and that's the hill shading model. And then just all the specs, because I have to basically send this thing up there and have someone that's never mounted a giant thing like this before to make it as simple as possible for them to install this piece. So that's going to be a big project. That's going to be in Williams Lake. That's where their office will be. This is Mount Carleton Provincial Park in New Brunswick. I just thought this was cool because it's a park surrounded in a sea of clear cuts. If you took the line off, you would still see the park boundary because the cut lines go right up to the park boundary. This is San Quentin in northwestern New Brunswick. I thought this was cool because you have this urban pattern and then completely surrounded. It looks like some really neat forestry, but if you zoom in, all of that's clear cuts. All of that is some type of forest operation that's created all those patterns. And then you have the human pattern in the middle. This is Kensington and Prince Edward Island. I just thought this was cool because it's the old town. I think it used to be called 5 Points. And so you have it kind of looks like something you'd see in Ireland or something with, and then you got all the farm patterns. This is West Cape and Prince Edward Island. I just thought that the way the water was, it looks like an alien sticking out into the space, but all the yellow dots are the wind farm. I'm at one of the biggest wind farms in Eastern Canada. No, that shows up in the Sentinel imagery. But the yellow wall is affecting the color of the maps too. So this is Magdalen Islands, and they have LiDAR there too. I can't. There's a name. I posted this on Facebook. There's a name for this type of spit where the two land masses and the water that goes around them will form this bridge in between them. And this is a big one. Yes. That's it. Huh? The one of the whole island, yes. And then when I found the LiDAR, I decided to zoom in closer and do that. That's it. Any questions?
You must sit at your computer all the time, I imagine. Or
Try
a lot of time.
I have lots of gardens.
You have lots of gardens too?
It
Wow.
keeps my sanity.
Good. Questions?
So when you do those early maps around Vancouver,
Yeah.
when you start with a clear base map, an outline of the territory, and then add on?
In BC, they were very ahead of the game in digital mapping. So BC had their mapping program was called TRIM, Terrain Resource Information Management, and they started in the late 1980s, going right to digital. So because it's driven by forestry there, forestry is so much money involved, and the terrain is so big and harsh, and the road building that goes on, so they funded this mapping program.
So you go in, download the area that you...
Back then you had to buy it. You had to buy that. It was only forest companies that could afford that data. Each map sheet was 20,000 map sheet was $600. So I had purchased like literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in data that was used for, but it was all mostly forest companies. And the way the province worked it was, you weren't allowed to publish a map or make a map like a tourist map. They would force you to sign an intellectual properties agreement, and then they would want a royalty from you. So coming to Nova Scotia, where you have the rich province, Nova Scotia, and all their data is free, and out in BC, it's you have to pay for it. I don't know. I'm kind of out of the loop, but no, you still have to go through all this red tape to. Because there's no tourism style map. Like we did the Waddington map that we were the only ones to actually legally publish these maps, and it was not a money. We lost money. Yeah.
Just a quick comment, and that if you took all those Nova Scotia maps and
Yeah.
put them in a book, I would buy it in a heartbeat.
I'm working on it.
Is there anything legal or as part of your employment that would hinder that?
No.
Yeah.
I work for myself, so I'm trying to pitch it to Goose Lane to do a coffee table book that has these type of plates, and then has a little bit of like poetry, art, and kind of make it a mishmash. So I'm trying to, Dan Connellan, he's at the Maritime Museum, him and trying to find someone PEI, and I have someone in New Brunswick that could do the writing, and then talk about geology. Yeah. So yeah, it's a lot of work too.
But I think that your fascination with maps is really very widespread. I've met so many people
I always
who
find that
love maps.
you end up, it's such a niche thing that, it's always the big seller thing. So yeah, it's a thing you got to juggle to try to find that little niche market and a publishing company that will.
My brother was a map maker, but it was for the CIA, so I think his maps were a little different.
Those maps don't exist.
Marcel, when you were doing the mapping with the Métis in Alberta and comparing the oral histories and your other sources, did you find yourself having to resolve conflicts of information?
No, I was here, so I didn't have to. But we were.
Did the maps lead to resolution of conflicts, or did they find moments of?
No, so the maps were both for historical to pass on to future generations, but they were also using it for negotiation with oil and gas companies, because they would just go in and drill, cut lines and drill wherever they wanted on the reserves. And they couldn't say a thing about it. So, and plus, a lot of times they lived here, But they put the reserve, the Métis settlement here and said, go there. And so they were using that to show, well, we were actually here, using it as evidence. And so, yeah, they use this as ways of negotiating compensation with oil and gas pipelines and stuff like that. So yeah, I had the oil data set for Alberta, northern Alberta, and that data set had 2 million wells, 2 million wells. And a lot of them are abandoned wells and stuff like that. So we would show progression maps that go, show oil, a Métis settlement, oil and gas wells in 1930, 40, and and as time goes by, the whole thing just fills up with. And there was lots of instances where Métis, who were kind of nomads, would pick berries here and there, 1930s, 1940s. Then suddenly they get run off by a cowboy with a shotgun saying, don't come on my land. And so there are areas where they could gather and stuff like that, slowly dwindled over time. Lakes got polluted and they couldn't fish, or everyone was fishing there as part of the livelihood, and the lake got fished out. And then you could see over time that desperation, like in the 80s when weird crafting like pine cone crafting was popular in the 80s, they would be collecting pine cones to sell to craft companies and just to make a living, or picking berries and stuff like that. So it was a neat project because you would be going through these things and people would be writing stuff and you could kind of get to know them. And they talked about, residential school and a lot of vets who went to fought in World War II and then came back and were basically had nothing and were pushed off their land and stuff like that. So yeah, it was a long project and definitely intimately knew all the stuff that was going on there, but I did it from here.
Any other questions? Oh,
So we have two from Zoom. The first one is, are you familiar with GRASS GIS program, and is it outdated for current data sets and LiDAR?
I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it.
Great. And the second question is, what is happening with the good old National 150,000
Topographic maps?
Yeah. New editions seem to be fewer and fewer.
Yeah, the printed ones, I'm not sure what's going on with that. They might not even be printing them anymore. But the data is all digital, and I still use that digital database. But it is getting outdated, and LiDAR is kind of replacing it.
any other questions? Yeah, let me give you the microphone because that way soon people can hear.
So Thompson did a lot of map making
Yeah.
some time ago.
Yeah.
Have they ever, like they published his maps, I understand, but has anybody gone back and looked at it with LiDAR?
People are taking old maps and superimposing
Enhancing
them
them.
onto hill shading so that this old map suddenly looks three-dimensional.
Yeah.
People are doing that, but that's mostly, you have to find a good quality scan of it to be able to do it.
Any last questions, maybe? And yes, okay. Don't trip, right?
Marcel, with all due credit, you only used the term once tonight, but there's one term I find should be removed from the Canadian lexicography and from our legal system. What the name of whatever is Crown land? It's an insult to the Canadian public, and particularly to the Indigenous. But anyway, that's
I know. I don't know what else you would call it. Commons.
Public would be a good
land,
start. Indigenous would be a good start.
Yeah.
But crowned, I won't
Still
say anything more
used,
about Charles.
Still used. Yeah, every province still calls it Crown land, and some places don't. I know here you can access it from the provincial site, the Crown land, but other provinces you can't access it, so you don't know. Or if you want to make your own maps, you can't access it. Don't know.
No,
Well, thank you all for
very good.
listening to me.
Yeah. Help me. Yeah. If you wouldn't mind just stacking the chairs as usual in 10 so we can get rid of them. And happy holidays, everybody. We're back here in what's the next month? January? 3rd Tuesday of the month. Thanks for coming out. I have just been told that there's still mulled wine there if you would like some.